Hello, welcome everybody to another Tuesday Tech Talk. Before we get started, I know I've been out of the loop. I've been working in a client's office for the last couple weeks, so I'm trying to keep up to date with the Tech Talks, but I'm falling behind. But I do know that Dirk has recently sent out an email asking for more speakers. I think he said in the email that we have enough people to the end of December, but after that it's looking kind of flaky. Even though that seems like it's far out, it's not that far away. It's been like 6, 7, 8 weeks. So again, if you're looking to give a talk, a lightning talk, a full talk, we could even, if you find a buddy, you could do 2 talks instead of 1 full talk. You do a lot of fun stuff like that. So let us know. We're always looking for new speakers. But without further ado, today we have Mayra. She is going to talk to us about accessibility, which she's going to try to explain to us, or maybe ask you guys to explain it for her. But she has had 3 projects from government projects, and she's going to tell you how they went and how it affects accessibility. Without further ado, Mayra.
Hi. Can you guys hear me okay? Cool. Yeah, so as Joe mentioned, as many of you know, I've been going to DC a couple times to work with our office out there. Have worked on a couple government projects, and then prior to joining Pivotal, had also worked with the University of California, where there was requirements to think about accessibility when we were designing and developing products. So just wanted to share some of the things I've learned and how it might apply to some of our projects here, or things that you can think about to make your product more accessible to larger audiences. But before I jump too far into it, I'm curious to know a little bit more about the audience. Can you raise your hand if you've ever worked on a project that required you to focus on accessibility? Awesome. And from those people, raise your hand if you did that and it was not a government-related project. Awesome. Good to know. So maybe from the people that raised their hands, could one of you guys tell the audience what accessibility means, or how you define accessibility? Yep. Awesome. Thank you. So I have like a definition up here that I liked, which said, accessibility refers to enabling people with disabilities to perceive, understand, navigate, interact with, and contribute to the web. So I think that encompasses a lot of things. Mainly when we've been looking at accessibility, we try to think, can someone with a disability use the site, access the information, and then contribute to it? And when we talk about disabilities, there's a couple things that we think about. And there's kind of 3 sort of senses that we consider. So that's like visual, physical, and then hearing. And all of these are kind of on a spectrum. So, for example, within vision, what are some examples, you guys can just shout them out, of things that you might want to consider, like visual impairments to consider when you're designing for the web? Color blindness, epilepsy, contrast, font size. Yep. So primarily the disabilities we think about would be someone who's completely blind and can't see anything. And these people, not sure how many of you guys are familiar, but they would use assistive technologies. There's screen readers that people use. And we could do a demo of that later so that you guys can become familiar with what that experience is like. We also think of people with low vision. So when you think of the elderly, or even myself, I wear glasses. And sometimes when I use some applications, it's hard for me to see the font size. So I have to bring the computer a lot closer to me, or I have to use like zoom text to see things up close. And then also color blindness. So when you're representing things in color, there are colors that some people can't see. So if you're using color to communicate, consider that not everybody can see the full spectrum of colors. What about physical impairments? What are some things that might come up there? Paraplegic. Yeah. So oftentimes I think when we talk about physical impairments, people tend to think of permanent ones, but you could also consider that sometimes somebody could break their arm and they don't have an arm to use. So these could be both temporary or permanent. And I think oftentimes when we talk about disabilities, people tend to think it's a smaller portion of the population, but the more there are people that are living longer, people that are older using technology, also like accidents happen and sometimes people don't have all their limbs they can use. Question? Yep. Yeah, definitely. Arthritis is a big one. And then with hearing, there are people that can't hear at all, and then there's also hard of hearing, so either way. I think we've covered, I don't know why not everything's showing up, but that covers most of it. We already talked about it. Oops. So accessibility within the government. When we're talking about the government, there's a bit more, a stronger requirement around accessibility. So I don't know if we've worked on any government projects here in the LA office, but when we've worked with the government in the DC office, there are hard requirements that you must make your products comply with what is called Section 508, which I think came through the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that has some clear guidelines around things that you need to make sure are in place in order for your product to pass compliance. And they usually have people within different agencies that focus on 508, and you have to take your product to them and they test it and then they say, okay, you're good to go live or you're not good to go live based on how the outcomes of the testing go. Those guidelines are clear but also pretty, they're guidelines, so they're not hard rules, which means that sometimes they'll tell you what to consider, but they won't be very specific about it, which means that you have some flexibility in terms of how you decide to go forth and apply some of those rules. I won't go into too much detail here, mainly because we don't work on a lot of government projects, but I can send out the resources and you guys could read through them, and I will talk about some that do affect a larger amount of people that we might want to consider on everyday projects. Yeah, so in my first project, or on only one of my projects, we had a 508 expert on our team. So we had learned, before I joined the project, they had done a first project with this group. They didn't have a 508 expert, and they waited till the end to then consider 508. And the big lesson learned there was that it caused a lot of rework, and they thought, well, we need to bring somebody in earlier in the process and make 508 or like accessibility sort of a first-class citizen in the process so that we can make sure that we consider them as we're building rather than wait till the end and then have to do some rework. So when I joined the project at that point, they had brought in an expert, and at that office, they tend to advocate at the very beginning of projects to bring on a 508 person onto the team, maybe not permanently, but somebody that comes to visit the team at least once a week so that we could go over questions with them, they could look over our product, and especially at the beginning to get us set up with the assistive technologies that we have to test with. Good question. The other thing I have on here are the web content accessibility guidelines. These are pretty much in line with 508, and depending on the agency you're working with and the product that it is, they may tell you what level you have to be at. Normally we've worked at AA, so somewhere in the middle. But depending on who your audience is if this is specifically for people with disabilities, you might go all the way to AAA compliance. Any questions related to this within the government? Okay, I'll move on to the next one. So when I was thinking about putting this talk together, I realized that we often don't work on government projects here, but I think one of the lessons learned I've had over the time working on these kinds of projects is that there's a lot that you could do that is really low lift, just to make your product more accessible to wider audiences. And as long as you're aware of it earlier on, you could just do it in the moment. So I think before I had worked on these projects, some of these things were things I had never really thought about before because I don't have a lot of these disabilities, so I wasn't very aware. And now since I've worked on these projects, even on non-government projects, I'll start thinking about like, okay, let me make sure my contrast is okay. Let me make sure I'm thinking about what colors I'm using. And it's not, I think oftentimes people will think we're building an MVP, this is a small portion of the population, but really it can affect a large audience. And there's such low lift things that you could do that it's really easy to just incorporate it into the process anyway. So I'll go over some of those things. Yeah, but I'm not working on a government projects. Oops, I didn't finish my sentence. He's like, I don't know. So first one, don't use color as the only visual means of conveying information. And for that, I have a pop quiz. So let's look at this example from the web. Can you tell me how many fields here are in an error state if I strip away color? Feel free to shout it out. One? Okay. Sounds like consensus is 1. Really, all 4 of them. But the icon only showed up on this one, which is the one I think that most people were thinking about. So as you can see here, there are different ways to communicate that something's in an error state besides just color. And if you're aware of that and are thinking about not using color as the only visual means of representing something, then you could immediately throw in an icon, or like you could be creative about however you want to communicate it. There's lots of ways to communicate that something's in a different state. So that's something to consider. Another thing that I've learned working on these projects that I try to do now is, for example, links tend to just be in the color blue. But when we work on government projects, we underline them so that people know that they're links. Any questions related to not using color as the only means of conveying information? Another thing that I see often, is sometimes with data visualizations, people tend to use a green to red spectrum. That is not very helpful for people who are colorblind. So sometimes the color spectrum I've been using on those kinds of projects is a blue to orange, and with something kind of in the middle, like a yellow-orange. So just things to think about. Another one is that you should ensure that there's sufficient contrast between text and its background, and this affects pretty much everyone. So even people that don't have visual impairments, sometimes it's really hard to see some grays especially that people tend to use on the web. And it's really easy to check. I recently installed something on my Sketch application where you could just select the layers that you want to compare, and it automatically goes off of the WCAG guidelines and tells you whether it passes contrast or not. So you could do it in the moment, and that's been really helpful. The guidelines give you like a ratio you should consider, and it's hard to tell by just looking, so like having tools that help you spot the ratio are really helpful. And the ratio changes depending on your text size. Although I would say, since working on this kind of stuff, I tend to avoid going below 18-point font, especially below 14. But I try to stick at 18. And I think that also is not just helpful for people that have visual impairments, it's just helpful for the general public when it's easier to read the content. So here's another quiz. Is this sufficient contrast? Raise your hand if you think yes. A couple of people. Yeah, it's also hard to tell on a projector, but this actually does pass contrast. But like I said, it's hard to tell on your own sometimes, and sometimes things are kind of in the middle, so it's really helpful to use tools to help you figure that out.
What's the ratio on that?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head, but I could pull it up afterwards. Yeah, WebAIM has a good resource. You just put in the 2 color codes.
I was just wondering, is it close or is that?
It is kind of close, yeah. And I think the only reason it passes, if this were a smaller text size, it might not pass, but because it's large, it does pass. Next one, provide visual focus indicator for the keyboard focus. So there are people, especially people that may have physical impairments, that use their keyboard to navigate the web, because it's hard to control a mouse, like exactly where it goes. So sometimes there's something that you have to do to turn on focus, and sometimes people turn it off. I forgot the exact details. If somebody else knows, feel free to shout it out. But sometimes that gets turned off, and then people are navigating with the keyboard and can't find their focus. So make sure that when you're coding your site, that focus indicators are on. So that's a pretty easy fix most of the time. And that just looks like this. So an example, I was navigating my Gmail using keyboard, and that just shows that mail is highlighted, so I can click on it. Visual indicators for clickable things, even tooltips, no show on hover. So something that I see happen a lot is people will create elements where you have to hover on it in order to see other options. And that's not very helpful, because oftentimes people that use, for example, text dictation, those tools won't spot elements that aren't already hovered on, so it can't tell somebody that there's something there to click on. And I think in general, sometimes it's just best practice to show people what the options are, or find other ways of hiding it, maybe within a drop-down or another format. But hover to show is not very helpful. And then just anything that is clickable, you should make it clear. So even tooltips, you should be able to click on them, not just hover over them. Again, because that helps with like keyboard navigation. So if you're navigating keyboard, like sometimes you don't know that there's something there to uncover. Yeah. And the last one, provide alt text for images. So people that are using screen readers know what an image is. If somebody can't see the image, it's helpful to provide a description of what it is. And then in general, some people have slow internet connections, or for whatever reason, if the image doesn't load, then they know what was supposed to be there. So I think it's just best practice, but also helps a lot of people do. So those are my top 5 things that I think are pretty easy to do, that sometimes we may forget about, but provide a lot of, provide a greater experience for a larger number of people. And obviously when you start looking into the exact guidelines, there's a lot more to consider. It takes a lot more work when you're trying to follow them and make everything totally accessible with a screen reader. But these are some simple things that you can start incorporating into your projects today that would help a lot of people. I'll pause here. Any questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say for icons, definitely use alt text. So that people know what it is, but I think that should mostly cover it. I think as long as they're, I think like buttons, then people should be able to access them when they're navigating on keyboard, and they should have a focus around them so that people know to click. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So I had like other topics we could discuss, but I can go into that one. Where is it? Oh, I didn't have it on here. So I can show an example of how we incorporate it into the pivotal process, if that's of interest. Oh, here I am. So this is an example of So like I mentioned before, one of the biggest lessons learned is that in the first time we worked, so I think I can talk about IRS because it's a public project. We worked with the IRS, and when we did the first project with them, we realized we didn't incorporate 508 into our everyday process. So when we did it the second round, we brought somebody in, but also we incorporated it into every story. So everything in this example, let me see what this story is. So this says, the logged in user can see additional details about payments in the recent payments list. And so we'd have our, Command plus. Cool. So then below the standard stuff we normally have on stories, then we would go into like all the different assistive technologies that we had to support and create all the details for those. And that would be incorporated into the tests that the developers were creating. So they all had these assistive technologies installed on their machines. And whenever we did acceptance testing and when they were checking their code, they would check to see if it behaved the way that we expected on the different assistive technologies. So like I said, this is definitely a lot more work than if you don't have these requirements, you probably wouldn't go this far, but because we had the requirements, we wanted to make sure that we focused on it so that by the time it went over to the 508 team and they had to check our product, that it would pass and we wouldn't have to do a lot of rework. And that's a big thing that we're working with our government clients is right now things are very siloed, so sometimes their developer teams sometimes don't even know the requirements that the other teams are checking against, and so there's a lot of back and forth. We're trying to create a more cohesive, balanced team. But for government balanced team also includes people that look at 508 and security. So we're trying to bring those people into the process with us. There are some tools, but not everything. So I think JAWS is fairly expensive, and it's the primary screen reader that people use. So we incorporated that, we had to purchase a license and install it on our machines. Yeah. Yeah, Apple's doing a lot of work with accessibility, and I think more people are starting to use that. For us, because JAWS is the one that people have used traditionally for a long time, we had to support it. So, any other questions? What's up?
What would be the hardest accessibility element? The hardest
Yeah. There's a lot of things. So for this particular project, let me see if I can have this screen up here. So we had created, so sometimes when you come up with elements that aren't common, I guess you could say, and are similar to other things. So in this example, this looks kind of like a table. There's column headers, but also it's a clickable table, so you could find more information within. And that ended up becoming difficult because initially a screen reader interacts with a table tag a certain way. So if something looks like a table, you might expect to navigate in such a way. But we couldn't code this as a table in order to allow for the click functionality. So we ended up having to come up with ways to allow it to navigate similar to a table but still perform other functionality. So when you kind of have these blends of things that seem standard like a table, but then you add a little more complexity to it, that starts becoming more difficult. There are a lot of libraries out there of common patterns that you could use that people have put together, but when you start mashing things up, those tend not to exist. So there's accessible tables and there's examples of well-coded elements, but once you add other things to it, then it gets more complicated. There's also, I don't know if it's on here, but no, we had this thing where you would click a button to load more payments to see. And I forgot the exact date, this was last year, but at some point we realized that within a screen reader you get stuck in this sort of infinite loop. and he couldn't get out of the table. So we took a while on that one, just because like if you couldn't see where to exit, it was hard to get to the exit, given like how we wanted you to navigate it. So we do think a lot, and like we'll like think of a design, we'll sort of implement it, and then we try to walk through like, if I was blind, like what are the different steps I have to take in order to navigate this whole thing? And we often realized that we had forgotten something, or like forgot an exit path that somebody who is sighted could easily spot, but somebody who can't see wouldn't be able to notice. Unfortunately not. There were some issues for like legal reasons, so it's really hard to test stuff with the government because they don't like to take people's time. There's a Paperwork Reduction Act, which means that you can't like survey civilians without going through some process. So we kind of had some workarounds for that, and our 508 expert didn't want to get involved with people that had disabilities for like that they might sue us, or that we didn't do something all the way, that they might come back and find reasons to like pick at the product. Which unfortunately he was the expert and he told us to do that. But we were going to test with somebody internally, but it just didn't end up working out. But it is really helpful. He was visually impaired, and he sometimes used a screen reader. So he kind of walked us through how he used some tools, and that was really helpful, because until you like see somebody trying to use those tools, it's hard to like really grasp how difficult it can be. Like the web is really hard for people with disabilities now. Yeah, I can show you an example. So I put in the slides, I can walk you through what a screen reader is like. So somebody put a YouTube video together of somebody navigating the New York Times using a screen reader. So I'll play that video so you guys can get a sense of what that's like. And one thing to pay attention to is like notice what you can see versus what the screen reader tells you. And sometimes the screen reader will just say like button, but it won't tell you what the button is, so you have no idea what happens when you click on it. Here we go. Oh no, I think my audio is off. Do I have to plug in or something? Do I use the remote? I'm trying to click the sound, but it's not letting me control it. Let me check this. Output HDMI?
Yeah, definitely. This thing has a volume. I don't know what this does like.
Oh, maybe that helps. Let's try it again.
But your volume on your computer?
So I try to do this.
Ooh. Alright, let's try.
Where is it?
Breaking news, world news and multimedia window, sections button, search button, internal link, list one item, link, end of list, login but settings but, list three item, US, link, end of list, heading, list one item, Thursday, link, end of leaving, list 12, link.
So as you can see, link doesn't tell you much about where that's going to go. So not too sure how they coded that, but for some reason they don't tell you where it goes, so that doesn't help somebody that can't actually see it. So it's really helpful to like run a screen reader through your application and get a sense of that. Do you have a question? Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. One thing that I did while I was on this project, I turned my phone onto VoiceOver and tried I challenge you all to go and turn your phone onto VoiceOver and try to just check the weather. It's really hard. Like, close your eyes and go through it. And I'm like, I was stuck, and then I couldn't exit VoiceOver, and that was really hard. So I was on VoiceOver for a little bit, and whenever you walked into our room where we were all working, like, you just hear screeners going off all the time, which is pretty funny. Any other questions? No? I think that's all of it.